Our gospel lesson for today comes from the gospel book of Matthew, chapter 5. We're going to read the first 12 verses that are known as the Beatitudes from Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Hear the word of the Lord. Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. This is the word of the Lord for the people of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, I'd like to begin with mentioning again a quote from our friend and neighbor whose name is Ethel. What she said to my wife a few weeks ago. She said, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself, and give unto God the value of what he gives you." I really like that, especially the last part. Give unto God the value of what he gives you. And I think it fits very well into this whole story and theme about the legend of the monk and the merchant, which is a book I've been reading and following here. The subtitle of it is 12 Keys to Successful Living. And first, to recap our story here, the legend of the monk and the merchant. Antonio and Filippo were friends who chose to serve the Lord in two different ways. One by being a monk, and the other by being a merchant in the marketplace. And Antonio shared his life story and what he had learned with his grandson, Julio. Antonio's story began in the monastery after his parents were killed in a ship on the high seas. And Filippo, an older monk, took Antonio under his wings as Antonio grew up. Filippo told him that he had to find his passion in order to serve God fully. So Filippo sent Antonio to his friend Alessio, who worked in the marketplace. After a few months in the marketplace, Antonio knew that his calling was not to be a monk, but to be a merchant, and to serve God in that process. And then after finding his passion in the marketplace, Antonio decided to do something different. So he created beads to offer in trade. 3 years later, Antonio and Alessio met again. And by now, Antonio had become a very successful merchant and was looking forward to learning some new principles for successful living from his friend and his business mentor, Alessio. Antonio felt very good at this time because after a lot of hard work, his business had grown. as his beads had become the standard used in the trade industry in Venice, and he found a young woman to marry. So he was successful. Things were going well. Last week we heard, in fact, that business was going so well that Antonio hired Milos to be his business manager. And all was going very well until a fire destroyed their factory, the shipping dock, and all the boats. So Antonio thought that all was lost. But Milos did not. He gave him a box which had these words on it, "With this we begin again." And Maria, his wife, reminded him of this verse from Romans 8:31, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" And before we look ahead here, let's remember the 6 principles that Alessio had taught Antonio so far. Principle 1, work hard and God will prosper you. Principle 2, financial prosperity is often connected to soul prosperity. 3, a man must do whatever he can to provide for his family. Principle 4, trials develop your character, preparing you for increased blessing. Principle 5, take responsibility for problems that are the result of your own bad decisions. Don't displace blame. And principle 6, see challenges as stepping stones, not as obstacles. And so this week the story continues. It is 3 years later, and Antonio has recognized that his greatest challenge has actually led to his greatest triumph. And Alessio recognizes that it's been taking some time for these principles to stick with his friend Antonio. 3 years earlier, during the cleanup from the fire, they received many blessings, one of which was that the largest customers of theirs actually sent workers to help them rebuild. And the new factory was ready within really just a few weeks. And then over the next 12 months, the business grew more than it had even in the prior 6 years. Why? Well, because Antonio learned to embrace challenges, seeing them as stepping stones or opportunities instead of disasters and catastrophes. So during this time of business renewal and growth, Antonio also met with some new key merchants from China and from Spain who wanted to use their Venetian beads as their primary currency. So business was booming with these new orders, and the factory was growing so fast that it was running out of space again. And it was time to build some more. Things were going very well, in fact, again, until Ahmad requested a meeting with Antonio. Ahmad was a very well-known person who was actually a notorious merchant pirate. Not everybody actually believed that he existed. He was kind of one of those legendary dread pirate guys. But for those who knew who he really was, he was greatly feared. And he wanted to meet with Antonio. Fortunately for Antonio, he had a meeting already scheduled with Alessio before he was going to meet with this Ahmad. And he told Alessio about everything that had happened, about the new factory, the new trade routes they developed, and the house that he and Maria had built together. And then after all those pleasantries were over, they got down to business. and Antonio told him about Ahmad wanting to meet with him. They talked about Ahmad, who he was, and the way that people feared him. And when the question came up as to whether Antonio should meet with him, Alessio said, "Of course, yes." Well, Antonio wasn't too sure because he didn't know how he would react if Ahmad would do something unseemly. You see, Antonio had grown a reputation for aggressiveness in business, and this had gotten him into trouble at times, but it had also made him quite successful. And Antonio went on to tell Alessio about a meeting that he had with Filippo and some of the monks at the monastery. They had told him that it was a mistake to be aggressive in business. After all, Jesus said that the meek shall inherit the earth. But Alessio explained that God wants us to be kind to others and to live to please Him more than to live to please people. Which brings us to principle 7. Be meek before God, but be bold before men. Meek before God, but bold before men. So Alessio told Antonio he should be meek before God, but bold before men. When he met then with Ahmad, he was to go remain strong in his beliefs and principles. And this principle here reminds me of those Beatitudes that Jesus taught during the Sermon on the Mount. We don't have time to really go into each of the Beatitudes. We read them earlier in the Gospel today, but they remain good guidelines for us and reminders of the attitudes we should have in our lives today. And these attitudes must be important for us today because Jesus taught them to his disciples, who in turn have passed them on to us down through the years in the church for today. And in the Beatitudes, Jesus basically described Christian character that flows from within. And when you think about it, when you read through each one of these, you soon sort of come to realize that these are all attitudes that the world considers weaknesses. And think about it. The world sees these things as weaknesses, but God sees them as strengths. And in each one of these statements made by Jesus, the Greek word that's used in the original text and is traditionally translated as blessed is makarios, means blessed. Recently, though, in some of the newer Bible translations and versions, it's been translated as happy or fortunate, but blessed is the best translation, because makarios is a state of existence in relationship to God in which a person is blessed from God's perspective, even when he or she doesn't necessarily feel happy or experiencing good fortune, they can still be blessed. And this does not mean a conferral of blessing or an exhortation to live a life worthy of blessing. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that the one indicated is blessed by God. So let's just quickly look at the attitudes we should have and then focus on the one that Antonio really needed to work on. Okay? The Beatitudes tell us we should be poor in spirit, meaning that we should be humble and helpless people before God and put our whole trust in Him. That's poor in spirit. being humble and helpless before God, trusting Him with everything. We should also mourn for the injustice, errors, and sins of the world, as well as our own. Our hearts should break for that which breaks God's heart. That's mourning. We should hunger and thirst for righteousness, because we want this world to be the way that God intended it to be. And when we respond to Jesus' invitation into the kingdom, our hearts will be transformed. And we will see all types of things that are wrong in the world, which we may not have even noticed before. And we should look to start making them right in whatever ways that we can. Then we should be merciful. In His great mercy, God has chosen to not give us what we really deserve, which is condemnation. Rather, He gives us grace. He's merciful and gives us grace that we do not deserve. So in turn, we should offer mercy to those around us. Be graceful. We should be pure in heart. A pure heart belongs to one with a single-minded purpose, and that is to be loyal to God in every area of one's life. That's being pure in heart. And we should be peacemakers. And this term peacemakers really indicates completeness and wholeness in every area of life, including our relationship with God and with our neighbors. Basically, this is talking about shalom. That's what this is. We should accept persecution due to righteousness and feel blessed when people insult us, persecute us, and falsely say all kinds of evil against us because of Christ. This happens to me sometimes. And, I don't necessarily like it, but I think that I would rather have 100 people say things against me because I've done what I believe is right in God's eyes than to have to deal with His wrath for doing what the world says is right. I know sometimes it feels and seems backwards, but it's often referred to as the great reversal for that reason. And that brings us to the beatitude that relates to Antonio. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And this is the one that Antonio had to learn most of all, because the domineering, the aggressive, the harsh are the ones that try to dominate the earth and establish their own kingdoms. But Jesus says it is the gentle who will inherit the earth. And meekness in the world today is seen as spinelessness. But that is not the meaning of this beatitude. Meekness means humble and gentle. But meekness is not weakness. No, look at meekness as controlled strength. Think of Jesus. He had all the power in the universe. He could have done anything to defend himself or anyone else, and yet he was meek about it all. Both Jesus and Moses were meek men. Both were gentle, but bold. A couple others who come to mind in the Bible would be Joseph and Daniel. And about Moses, Numbers 12 verse 3 says, "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. And yet This meek and humble man jumped into the middle of a fight to defend a slave. And he was also bold enough to stand up to Pharaoh, who was probably the most powerful man in the world at that time. Jesus, we learn in Matthew chapter 11, says this about himself: "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Yet, he went into the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers. He fashioned a whip and drove them all out of the place, just he himself. That doesn't sound weak. You see, these men were meek, they were humble and gentle, but also they showed a healthy aggression that allowed them to fulfill their purpose to further God's kingdom. And for those in the marketplace, hear this: God wants you to be humble and to make sound judgment in business. Matthew 10 says, "Be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves." Meek people do not assert themselves over others in order to advance their own causes. And we are all here to advance God's cause. And you know, it takes great strength to bring others into God's will. But when that strength is coupled with a selfless non-assertiveness, it produces a gentle person who can patiently endure much to bring about God's purpose for his people. That's meekness. So remember these attitudes as we hear the end of today's part of the story. Antonio went on and met with Ahmad, who had been given 5 of Antonio's beads, and he wanted to use them in his business. He wanted Antonio to provide his fleet with trading beads. And Antonio found that Ahmad actually was not a man to fear. And with this new formed business alliance, Africa, India, Egypt, and other lands across the sea opened up for Antonio, and within several years his dream of a universal currency had become a reality. And his business grew beyond his greatest expectations. And he was becoming known as one of the most influential merchants in the world at that time. And none of this would have happened had Antonio not been brave enough to face his fears and meet with Ahmad. You see, our attitudes are important, and so is the way that we handle fear. We need to turn this area of our lives over to God. The author of the book I've been reading while doing this is named Terry Felber. And in his book he lists 4 things that fear can stand for, if you use the 4 letters, F-E-A-R. First he says fear stands for false evidence appearing real. False evidence appearing real can lead to fear. 2, finding excuses and reasons. It's fearful behavior, finding excuses and reasons. 3, fear is failure expected and received. If you're fearful and expect failure, you're probably going to receive it. And 4, forget everything and run. Fear, that fits. He also says that fear is temporary. Regret is forever. Actions get rid of fear. Fear can be a big part of our lives, and it can make us miss so much if we live in fear and don't act on things we ought to or want to do. And had Antonio not gone to see Ahmad, his business would not have grown to the proportions that it eventually did, and he would not have been able to help as many people as he eventually was able to. He also found out that Ahmad was not a fierce man at all, but rather one who was smart and articulate. And had he never faced his fear, he would have never known that. The Bible is clear that fear is not God's way. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and self-discipline." We are anxious about nothing. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." So what do we learn from this today? Well, we learn to have a correct attitude, one that is pleasing to God, and not to worry about what the world says about us. We also learned not to live in fear, but to turn it all over to God. Don't you want to be successful as God defines success? Yes, I know that I do. If you are willing to live your life by these important principles, then you may truly become happy, fortunate, and blessed. I pray that you do. Shalom to you. In Jesus' name, amen.